Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished judges, teachers, and enthusiastic students. Welcome to the finals of the National Tourism to Debate competition. Today, we will witness a thrilling intellectual face-off between two exceptional schools, Charlemont High School and Knox College. Let's have a round of applause. We're honored to have with us a distinguished panel of judges whose expertise and keen eyes will ensure a fair and stimulating competition. Alden Reed, representing the JHTA, Unique Salesman, CEO for Tourism Booster Online, and Gavay Watt from the Jamaica Observer. The competition is set to run for approximately 45 minutes, during which each team will present well-researched arguments followed by the rebuttals. So without further ado, let's meet our team members. Charlemont High.
Good afternoon, Kadalee McLean.
Good afternoon, Shaquan White.
Good afternoon, Anthony Demetrius.
And proposing Knox College.
Good afternoon, Jenny Scott.
Good afternoon, Summer Anderson.
Good afternoon, Sharian Smith.
This afternoon's motion, Caribbean tourism is sufficiently resilient to survive the tariff regime imposed by the USA. Proposing the moot is Charlemont High, and opposing the moot is Knox College. The match will take the format of a parliamentary-style debating competition. The first speaker is allowed 7 minutes, second speaker 5 minutes, third speaker 3 minutes, followed by the rebuttal, which will begin with Knox College. Let's invite our first speaker from Charlemont High.
Madam Speaker, a pleasant morning, members of the opposition, esteemed judges, and special guests. Today, we on the government bench rise with confidence to affirm the motion. Caribbean tourism is resilient enough to survive the tariff regime imposed by the United States. Let us clarify the key terms of the motion. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development defines resilience as the capacity to absorb disturbance, recover from disruption, and adapt to changing conditions while retaining essentially the same function. It's not just about surviving, it's about recovering and performing even under pressure. The Oxford Dictionary defines survive as to continue to live or exist, especially in spite of danger or hardship. A tariff, by general definition, is a tax on imported goods. In the context of this debate, the USA's tariff regime, as reported by the Guardian news articles, includes a current 10% tariff on the Caribbean and most countries, with countries, for example, Guyana, facing reciprocal tariffs and China facing retaliatory tariffs. However, it's not just about the tariffs. It's about economic uncertainty and volatility. It's about the consequences should a severe tariff regime take effect for a prolonged period. We can now restate the motion to read. Be it resolved, Caribbean tourism has the capacity to absorb disturbances, recover from disruptions, and adapt to changing conditions so that it continues to exist in spite of hardship as a consequence of the economic volatility caused by the tariff regime of the USA. I, your Prime Minister, will present our case for why Caribbean tourism has resilience through cooperation and our competitive advantage. My second speaker will show that we have measures to help protect our most vulnerable stakeholders and that we have response systems that can help us adapt and soften the blow of various crises. Lastly, our third speaker will outline key opportunities and strategies that the Caribbean can use to not just recover, but adapt and evolve. The government, Madam Speaker, is not ignorant to the reality of the worst-case scenario. Let me be clear. The Caribbean is vulnerable. Caribbean tourism faces two major threats from U.S. tariffs: higher operational costs and fear tourist arrivals due to higher import prices, U.S. inflation, or the worst-case scenario, an American or global recession. The consequences could range from major revenue losses for hotels, restaurants, and tour operators, widespread closures of small tourism businesses, and mass unemployment in tourism-dependent islands. But vulnerability is not the absence of resilience. Vulnerability is how exposed we are to risk or shocks. Resilience is the ability to respond, recover, and emerge stronger from these shocks. Think of a coconut tree in a hurricane. It bends, it sways, but when the storm is over, it's still standing. That's the Caribbean. We bend, but we do not break. We are not defined by our circumstances. Yes, we're small
Point of
economies.
information.
Go ahead.
The Caribbean tourism sectors in many countries are actively operating in a deficit. We are not performing adequately. We're barely surviving already.
Where is your evidence to support this, Madam Member of the Opposition? It bends. Well, pardon me. Think of a coconut tree in a hurricane. It bends, it sways, but when the storm is over, it's still standing. That's the Caribbean. We bend, but we do not break. We are not defined by our circumstances. Yes, we're small economies. Yes, we're import dependent, but that doesn't mean we're weak. We all know the Jamaican saying, we're little, but we're Talawa. We have resilience in regional cooperation. No island stands alone. The Caribbean small island developing states face disproportionate exposure to external shocks, yet it is precisely in our shared vulnerabilities that we find a collective strength. Through regional bodies like CARICOM and the Caribbean Tourism Organization, the region has consistently demonstrated the power of unity and coordination in times of crisis. Go ahead.
CARICOM does not have a fiscal budget to allocate towards these tourism sectors.
No, you're misunderstanding the point, Madam Member of the Opposition. I'm not saying that CARICOM allocates its budgets. I'm saying that CARICOM is a body that helps Caribbean countries to work cooperatively. The Caribbean Tourism, through regional bodies and the Caribbean Tourism Organization, the region has consistently demonstrated the power of unity and coordination in times of crisis. The Caribbean Tourism Organization has unveiled its theme for 2025, Caribbean Resilience, Crafting Tomorrow's Tourism. This timely and forward-thinking theme underscores the region's commitment to embracing its strengths, addressing challenges, and creating a future-ready tourism sector that continues to thrive in an ever-changing global landscape. In times of crisis, we pull together. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Caribbean Tourism Organization, Caribbean Public Health Agency created region-wide health decline and safety protocols, helping countries reopen safely and reassuring international tourists. This spirit of cooperation has already borne fruits in initiatives like the CARICOM 25 by 2025 Food Security Plan led by Ghana's President Ifan Ali, which aims to reduce the region's food import bill by 25% by 2025. In response to the looming tariff crisis, the Honorable Myanmar Motley, CARICOM Chair Barbados Prime Minister, stated that we are and have always been at the whims of global prices. Our economies are small and vulnerable. But if we tap into the strength and innovation of our common Caribbean spirit, we will see this through. We can see this through because we also have a type of resilience that tariffs cannot easily damage. That is brand resilience. Our brand resilience is a direct result of our competitive advantage in tourism. Caribbean tourism is not just a product, it's a global brand, synonymous with sun, sea, and serenity. And that brand has proven incredibly resilient and competitive over time. We are the tourism capital of the Western Hemisphere. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council 2023 report, the Caribbean is the most tourism-dependent region in the world, and yet it was also the fastest tourism recovering region post-COVID, rebounding by 36.6% in 2022 compared to the global average of 22%. And we were already exceeding pre-pandemic levels just within 2 years after the pandemic. This remarkable bounce back point of order, I'm in my last minute. This remarkable bounce back speaks to the strength and enduring appeal of the Caribbean brand. Madam Speaker, I leave you with the words of Prime Minister Motley. Our world is in crisis. I will not sugarcoat it, but my friends, we can make it. We shall make it. For these reasons and more, we proudly affirm the motion. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, members of this honorable House, and my worthy opponents, a pleasant afternoon. Allow me to remind the government that the motion is speaking to the sufficiency of the Caribbean tourism sector as it is currently. As the leader of the opposition, it is my duty to redefine the key terms of this motion, explain the current reality of the U.S. tariff regime and its unpredictability, and contextualize why Caribbean tourism today is not sufficiently resilient to withstand these external pressures. I will show that heavy reliance on U.S. imports, rising operational costs, weakened export earnings, and increasing travel expenses caused by tariffs all make the industry highly vulnerable. Our second speaker will examine the economic impact of the U.S. tariff regime on Caribbean tourism. Finally, our third speaker will focus on the special vulnerabilities of small island developing states, outlining their dependence on tourism and the exposure to external shocks. Allow me now to redefine the key terms of this motion. Sufficient means fully adequate, meeting all necessary standards without significant shortfall. This term demands that Caribbean tourism is not barely coping, but thriving despite the U.S. tariffs. Given the rising operational costs, shrinking visitor numbers, and deepening dependence on external markets, we are clearly falling short. Resilience means able to recover quickly and strongly from adversity, maintaining growth and stability even under pressure. Resilience requires strong foundations. Our tourism sector, heavily import dependent and vulnerable to foreign policy shifts, is liable to buckle. A tariff is a financial burden, a government-imposed tax that increases the cost of doing business and forces consumers and industries to absorb higher prices. These U.S. tariffs are not neutral obstacles. They are active economic weapons destabilizing key sectors, including tourism throughout the Caribbean. Regime refers to a deliberate and structured system, not a random occurrence. The U.S. tariff regime is a systematic, aggressive economic strategy that is escalating trade tensions globally, causing uncertainty and damaging smaller economies
Opposition
that lack
leader,
the size and leverage to quickly retaliate.
Point of information,
Not
opposition.
accepted. Let's look at the global picture. Major players like Canada and China are already being affected by these tariffs. Canada's tourism sector is already experiencing a 75% decline in US-bound flights, and US tourism operators are reporting drops in bookings of up to 90%. If those first world countries are currently suffering under these policies, how can we in the Caribbean be claiming that we are sufficiently resilient? To suggest that is not only naive, it is delusional. Mr. Speaker, the CHTA warns of a potential domino effect on tourism arrivals and revenues. We acknowledge potential for future resilience, but currently we are not there. Now is the time for realistic assessment. Mr. Speaker, allow me to demonstrate why Caribbean tourism is not sufficiently resilient at this time. Firstly, Jamaica is being viewed as expensive due to its dependence on US imports amidst a 10 to 38% US tariff, while emerging competitors not accepted. While emerging competitors like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Colombia are restructuring their economies to utilize more local resources. These countries are currently investing in local food systems, infrastructure, and labor, whereas we are still depending on imports to survive. Secondly, our exports used to fund tourism are threatened. Mr. Speaker, countries like Trinidad and Tobago depend on export to fund public services, including tourism development. When tariffs hit our export markets, the state has less money to subsidize airports, ports, and hospitality programs. We are watching revenue dry up before we can redirect it. Thirdly, the cost of travel is increasing. Higher cruise port fees, increased fuel costs due to trade disruptions, and inflation in service pricing are pushing airfare and cruise packages upward. Mr. Speaker, these are not just figures on a spreadsheet. These are the real, growing costs for a family from New York or Toronto looking to book a vacation. Steve Hill, head of the Las Vegas Visitors Authority, is warning that the industry is losing... Accepted.
No, I want you to tell me, is it price alone that dictate tourist demand and behavior? Answer that.
No, but how are the tourists going to come if they have no money? Continuing, Steve Hill, head of the Las Vegas Visitors Authority, is warning that the travel industry is losing tourists to economic instability. If the US itself is being weakened, how can we pretend that we are not shaken? Mr. Speaker, the government is trying to spin this into a story of opportunity. Writers like David Summon in the Jamaica Gleaner recently wrote that Jamaica may find hidden benefits within a global trade war. Opportunity is not resilience. Opportunity is possibility, not reality. And we are debating the current sufficiency of our tourism tourism industry, not its future hopes. Mr. Speaker, the facts are clear. Our main supplier of tourism inputs is becoming unaffordable. We are experiencing shrinking funding for tourism development. We are facing rising prices that are pushing tourists away. We must confront the reality of our vulnerable tourism sector. Mr. Speaker, tariffs don't just burden governments, they burden people. Over 90% of tariff costs in the US are passed directly to the consumer, meaning it's the average worker who ends up paying more. During the 2018 US-China tariff war, this translated to $831 more per household annually, leaving families with less disposable income and fewer vacations, especially to the Caribbean. Retaliatory tariffs and import hikes on our end mean rising costs for essentials like food and hotel supplies. So it's not just tourists who suffer, it's the Caribbean worker, from the bartender in Montego Bay to the taxi driver in St. Lucia who earns less while paying more. Tariffs are a lose-lose, and the working class on both sides of the ocean pays the price. Beyond the immediate pain, the long-term consequences of the US tariff regime on the Caribbean would be devastating. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council 2022, tourism represents 15% of Caribbean GDP and employs 14.5% of our workforce. A 10% fall in US visitors, easily triggered by higher costs, could shrink GDP by 2 to 3% in many Caribbean states. The CDB warns that rising external costs will make us less competitive compared to destinations like Thailand and Costa Rica, where tourism packages are already 20 to 30% cheaper. The World Bank notes that tariff barriers discourage investment and perpetuate dependency. Without foreign investment, our diversification efforts will collapse, leaving us even more reliant on a fragile tourism sector. Most tragically, as the IMF warns, external economic shocks in small island economies disproportionately impact the poorest, widening inequality and social stability. The tariff regime does not just threaten tourism today, it threatens the very future of our economies, our social stability and our sustainable development. By and large, Mr. Speaker, it is transparent that Caribbean tourism is not sufficiently resilient as it currently stands. To say that otherwise is not just incorrect, it is irresponsible. This is not about giving up. It is about being honest. We need time, we need investment, and we need restructuring. The opposition yields the floor.
Madam Speaker, members of the government, opposition, esteemed judges and guests, good morning. As Deputy Prime Minister, I will demonstrate why we adapt and even thrive during these figurative storms. So before I go into my critical points, I must address the opposition's point on overdependence on imports. Madam Speaker, the opposition says is portraying the Caribbean tourism as fragile because our economies depend on imports. But let us be clear, tourism doesn't create import dependency. It helps to fund those imports. Tourists bring foreign exchange, which helps pay for vital goods. In fact, the industry is shifting to our local sourcing because we see more farm-to-table tourism, local artisan markets, and community-based ecotourism that strengthens local supply chains. Now I shall move on into my speech. Madam Speaker, in any storm like tariffs, the most vulnerable among us will feel it the worst. Opposition, larger multinational tourism players like Sanders and Royal Caribbean possess the capital, the brand strength, and marketing muscle to weather any storm. The Caribbean strategic brand resilience and global position is also heavily supported by these profit-driven giants. Madam Speaker, we know, however, that the U.S. tariff regime heavily threatens small and medium enterprises in the Caribbean tourism. Yet, what opposition does not understand, Madam Speaker, is that vulnerability is not helplessness. As our Prime Minister has likened Caribbean tourism to a coconut tree, we may lose a few coconuts in the storm, but we do not fall. We regrow. Proactive governments, Madam Speaker, even pick their coconuts in advance. Across the region, targeted support mechanisms bolster SMEs during shocks, Madam Speaker.
Point of information.
Not taken at this time. We can pick these coconuts, Madam Speaker. We can pick them up off the ground, Madam Speaker. Firstly, we are engaged in the Caribbean Development Bank's Emergency Response and Support Program. This emergency relief fund was used during the COVID pandemic, where over US $67 million in loans and grants opposition were mobilized for tourism, agriculture, micro, small, and medium enterprises. The same facility, Madam Speaker, can be used to protect SMEs facing decline during any new shocks.
Point of information.
Not taken. Number 2, there is also the Compete Caribbean Partnership Facility, a collaboration amongst the IDB, the UK's SCDO, and the CDB, Madam Speaker, that by 2024 helped more than 2,000 enterprises improve digital marketing, ecotourism, and even supply chains. Madam Speaker, governments are
Point
also
of
now passive
information.
actors in crisis, not taking national interventions during COVID, such as Jamaica's care program and St. Lucia's relief, measures like paying the utility bills of SMEs during COVID. This illustrates how governments step in to protect the most vulnerable. This layered support, which includes grants,
Points of information.
consensual loans, and technical assistance, ensure tourism MSMEs remain solvent through shocks. Badgering, bridging the gap between shutdown and survival. Another pillar of resilience, Madam Speaker, is the crisis response and management systems. The Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center, founded by our very own Tourism Minister Edmund Bartlett, provides strategy, research, and partnerships to prepare for pandemics, natural disasters, and trade conflicts. On March 2025, Jamaica Information Service article highlights Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center's collaboration with JICA and Airbnb to support coastal communities and SMEs across the region. Finally, opposition for food and import security. There is some cushion from CARICOM's 25 by 2025 initiative, highlighted by our very own Prime Minister. Jamaica's Alex platform links farmers directly with hotels. Aruba has the company 297 Farms, and the Cayman Islands, Madam Speaker, has the Primitive Greens initiative that, through the use of hydroponic farms, contribute to food security and reduce, Madam Speaker, reliance on imports by supplying supermarkets and hotels with fresh produce year-round. Also, there is also the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States FAST strategy that has introduced better cold storage and safety system. So, members of the opposition, the Caribbean is definitely making strides to become less reliant on imports. Madam Speaker, this is not mere survival. It is smart and structured resilience. It's what happens when governments plan, SMEs adapt, and communities transform. Resilience is not a buzzword, opposition. Resilience is not a buzzword. It is our blueprint as proposition. And every day we are building a stronger, more self-reliant Caribbean. I thank you.
Mr. Speaker, esteemed judges, and members of this honorable house, as the opposition, it is our prerogative to prove that the Caribbean tourism sector, as it is now, simply lacks the resilience necessary to survive the U.S. tariff regime. To establish this, I will begin by addressing the immediate economic pressures caused by these tariffs. Mr. Speaker, the United States is not a regular trading partner. It is the Caribbean's primary tourism market, accounting for over 60% of all tourist arrivals. It is also currently our largest supplier, with 40 to 70% of all our imported goods originating from the U.S. either directly or indirectly. Even the majority of goods we import from fellow CARICOM nations themselves are sourced from the U.S. as raw goods or finished products. Therefore, when these tariffs increase the cost of these imports by the projected 10 to 20%, then the effects will be both immediate and detrimental. In execution, Mr. Speaker, this means a hotel in St. Lucia now pays more to import food items, to stock bars, and to service rooms. This means a small villa in Grenada can no longer afford to keep their rates competitive. Across the board, our tourism products will become less affordable, less accessible, and thereby far less attractive. Side proposition claims that the sector is adaptable. However, Mr. Speaker, the tourism sector is also notoriously competitive and price sensitive. As established, the average American tourist will also face rising domestic costs due to this tariff regime, and consequently, they will gravitate towards more affordable destinations. And not only the Americans, but as tariffs slow global economic growth, travel for tourism will decrease constantly all across the globe. During the 2008 financial crisis, tourist arrivals fell sharply in the Caribbean countries like Antigua and Barbuda, which contributed to a double-digit loss in GDP. Now, according to the IMF, this regime could reduce global GDP growth by 1% within the year. A recession is afoot, and the Caribbean tourism sector cannot remain price competitive under these circumstances. Our second point, Mr. Speaker, is in regards to the existing internal fragility within these Caribbean economies. Side proposition opposition is idealistic if they believe that our internal structures can withstand a shock of this degree. Mr. Speaker, many Caribbean economies are small, deeply in debt, and heavily reliant on both tourism and the United States. Countries like Dominica and Grenada depend on the sector for over 50% of GDP. Even Barbados, which rivals Jamaica as a tourist destination, has a debt to GDP ratio nearing 100%. Now, these are not economies that can afford shocks. When tourism slows, governments have less to spend. Foreign exchange dries up and the costs affect essential sectors. That means, Mr. Speaker, that there will be less immediate funding available to delegate towards sustaining our tourism sector. Accepted?
Now, I want you to tell me, what alternative economic sector do you propose can immediately replace
That will
tourism?
be addressed by my third speaker. And this is not just about the government, Mr. Speaker, to provide evidence of the sector's fragility. In 2024, 1/3 of tourism businesses in the region posted net losses. Even before the full effects of these tariffs took hold, many of these small and medium enterprises did not have the capital to adapt. They were already in survival mode. The idea that these businesses will somehow survive under increased costs and lower demand is myopic and dishonest. The tourism industry is evidently already concerningly fragile. Now, to our third point, alternative funding does not exist. Mr. Speaker, the proposition may suggest that we could rely on investors, but the data says otherwise. In 2023, major international hotel chains paused expansion projects all across the Eastern Caribbean, citing economic uncertainties. This was without the pressure of a tariff regime imposed by a global superpower like the United States. The prospect of higher costs and lower tourist arrivals makes the region even less attractive. So investors who value stability will pivot. Right now, Mr. Speaker, according to the IDB and CHTA, over 70% of our tourism-related businesses have listed lack of investor confidence and high input costs as a critical constraint to COVID-19 recoveries. And that transitions me directly into my next point. Mr. Speaker, the proposition may argue that we have overcome past incidents. However, truthfully, we have not yet fully recovered and we are still incredibly vulnerable to additional shocks. Like COVID-19, this tariff regime will sharply inflate costs. However, according to the IMF, this time many countries are entering this period with elevated debt levels and high dependence on U.S. trade. This limits their ability to implement large-scale fiscal interventions without risking financial instability. That locks up certain corporations like CARICOM and other organizations. Mr. Speaker, this time everyone will be protecting their own individual economies, and that difference will be debilitating for our tourism sector. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we address the misguided reliance on diversification. The proposition may claim that we can pivot, but the reality is that most Caribbean states have been trying to diversify for decades. It has not yet been successful, not because of efforts being lacking, but because of systemic constraints. Tourism remains dominant because it is the only viable income generator in many of these Caribbean islands. And today, diversification will only become harder. Higher costs, higher competition, lower investor interest, lower resources, and no time. Mr. Speaker, none of these are reliable strategies to be implemented in the short run, and therefore it is unwise and dishonest of the proposition to state that the tourism sector of the Caribbean could be contextualized as sufficiently resilient against the U.S. tariff regime. And for that, the opposition pauses but momentarily.
Madam Speaker, esteemed judges, honorable members, guests, good morning. To address some of the arguments that our opposition may have, they talk about over-reliance on the U.S., but what happens to the U.S. when no one wants to work with them because of these tariffs? They talk about rising costs, but what happens, what is the government supposed to do? Stand back and do nothing? Can they not act in order to counter that? They talk about small islands not surviving and they're having no funds to fall back on. But what is not the support of the IMF and the Caribbean Development Bank? What about those? It is clear that the government has presented not just survival, but a roadmap of resilience and growth. Let's be clear. Yes, our U.S. tariff regime would present some challenges, but Caribbean tourism is not only capable of surviving, it is built to recover and adapt. So let's talk strategy. There are things we can do to adapt. A part of this strategy was outlined by the CARICOM Chair and Barbadian Prime Minister, the Honorable Mia Mottley, in her statement about tariffs in April 2025. But first in that statement, we negotiate. We must highlight to Trump's administration that we are not the real targets of these tariffs, and we have been good trade partners. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau in 2024,
Point of information.
Accepted.
There is currently no money within these banks to delegate to the smaller countries within the island. So how can you say that the IMF and similar funds will be delegated towards us?
Show me your sources that say they do not have it. Continuing. The U.S. Census Bureau stated that the U.S. ran a $5.8 billion surplus with the CARICOM as a whole. The trade situation is already in the U.S. favor, so let us leverage that and have these tariffs removed. Second, we unite. We can come together and support stakeholders by offering temporary tax relief for hotels, negotiating new free trade partnerships with countries seeking to step away from U.S. dependency, like Canada, like China. Governments can negotiate lower price bundles with airlines.
Points of information.
And in the words, rejected. And in the words of Ziggy Marley, we got options. Third, we diversify. While the opposition may be concerned about over-dependency on the U.S. market, they fail to consider the current global climate state. President Trump's America First policies have made them ostracized to the rest of the world. Places like places like Canada, Germany, and Spain, due to these diplomatic tensions and stricter border protocols, have relinquished some of their tourism people to the U.S. Canada dropping their visitors by 18%, Germany dropping their visitors by 28%, and Spanish arrivals dropping by 25%, rejected. Lastly, we can now market. Now is the time to increase our marketing campaigns in these countries. I can see the advertisements already. Tired of those tariff tantrums and border boot camps? Come to the Caribbean, where the only tariff you'll have is a 100% surplus in sunshine, and the only border you'll have to cross is between the beach chair and the bar. In conclusion, Madam Speaker, we learn, we adapt, we grow. We are the Caribbean. We are the coconut tree after the storm. Resilient, defiant. The government rests.
Mr. Speaker, all protocols observed. It is not necessary for me at this time to rebut, as I believe you should just go back to the research board. Moving on, I stand resolutely as the third speaker to firmly reinforce that Caribbean tourism is not sufficiently resilient to survive the U.S. tariff regime. My colleagues highlighted the industry's vulnerability and the regime's devastating economic impacts. My goal now is to focus on the nuanced vulnerabilities of small island developing states, particularly our Caribbean islands. States face unique economic realities due to factors such as their small size, island nature, and limited resources. Their high dependence on international trade and reliance on imported goods makes them susceptible to external shocks. For instance, Antigua's 2024 food import bill exceeded $1.2 billion, leaving its balance of payments vulnerable to spikes in shipping rates. Thomas Barnes, April 17, 2025. This stark reality, Mr. Speaker, underscores the need for targeted support. The paralyzing challenges faced by SIDS, including limited economic diversification and vulnerability to external shocks, further solidify our stance. Dominica and the Bahamas, still reeling from devastating hurricanes, exemplify the region's fragile base. The Caribbean Development Bank confirms tourism's vital role in Jamaica, Antigua, and St. Lucia, not accepted, with their tourism sector accounting for over 30% of their GDP. The impacts of the tariff regime on SIDS will be far-reaching, with one, increased costs. Having higher tariffs will increase costs for tourists, making Caribbean destinations less competitive. Two, reduce investments. Uncertainty and increased costs will deter investments in infrastructure, thus hindering economic growth. And three, job losses. The tourism industry's contraction will lead to job losses, exacerbating poverty and inequality. To mitigate these impacts, Mr. Speaker, we as the opposition propose targeted support, providing financial assistance and technical expertise to help SIDS diversify their economies and build resilience. Two, trade agreements, negotiating favorable trade agreements to reduce tariffs and increase export opportunities for SIDS. And three, disaster preparedness, investing in disaster preparation and response initiatives to minimize the impact of external shocks so that in return we can become not only resilient but sufficiently resilient. The government may argue, Mr. Speaker, that SIDS can adapt to the tariff regime by increasing local production. However, this overlooks the structural limitations and resource constraints faced by these economies. The fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is that though some SIDS may have made progress in diversifying their economies, many still heavily rely on tourism. The tariff regime imposed will only disproportionately affect these countries, exacerbating already existing vulnerabilities. In conclusion, the U.S. tariff regime poses significant threats to Caribbean tourism. With that, we urge policymakers to consider nuanced vulnerabilities of SIDS and take immediate action to provide targeted support. Let us act now to safeguard the future of Caribbean tourism and the well-being of SIDS. The opposition pauses.
Let's have another round of applause. It was such a good match. Such a good match, well researched. We will now break for the rebuttal section, and when we come back, we will return with Knox College, the opposing team. And we are back. We'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Royalton Resorts, the JHTA, Fontana Pharmacy, the Tourism Enhancement Fund, Pier 1 Restaurants. Our production partners, PBCJ, Home Choice Limited, Candace Delight, and Future Leaders. We will now invite Knox College to present their rebuttals.
Mr. Speaker, the proposition is both idealistic and myopic in their perspective, and in response to that, we must outline and rebut their fallacies. The Prime Minister of the House outlined at length a plethora of alternative sources of funding available to the Caribbean. However, we, as the opposition, would have proven that these sources simply do not exist. Under a tariff regime that will be imposed by a superpower like the US, our highest market economy, Mr. Speaker, it is anticipated that costs will inflate by up to 20%. The cost of living and cost of doing businesses will similarly rise around the globe. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, this, as we would have said, will increase the cost of our tourism product, and in such a price-sensitive and competitive industry, this can only lead to a decrease in demand. At length, Mr. Speaker, we would have proven that this lower demand will put the tourism sector in a deficit that will jeopardize them under a tariff regime. The primary tourism market, Mr. Speaker, the US, will decline due to additional tourism costs, and thereby, Mr. Speaker, the profitability of this industry will be directly jeopardized by this tariff regime. Worse yet, as we had stated, there will be no alternative sources of funding available from other entities or investors. Mr. Speaker, the funding that is available is simply not sufficient to account for the tourism sectors of all of these Caribbean countries and the many needs and funds needed to sufficiently carry them throughout a tariff regime. Mr. Speaker, a recession is afoot. We would have said this ad nauseum. And as the opposition and as the proposition, it seems that they do not fully understand the implications of a recession. It is not simply at most a rise in costs. This means that businesses, governments, and fundamental entities will be strapped for cash. And Mr. Speaker, funds will be scarce, yet demand for supplementary aid will be exacerbated. Mr. Speaker, we would have outlined this to the opposition, to the proposition, yet still they would have failed to understand this, and for that we would say, please do better. The opposition lives in a fantasy society where they seem to fail to understand that a tariff regime will put investors in such a position that they will not be able to adequately allocate resources towards our Caribbean economies. Mr. Speaker, in the context of diversification, that too is a fallacy, as diversification within the Caribbean has already been attempted and has not succeeded. It is not anticipated or logical for it to succeed when additional competition is afoot and our resources and money and funds are scarce, as well as time. Mr. Speaker, many of the sources and solutions that they have posited require a lot of bureaucratic processes, as well as money and time that we do not have in the here and now. For that, Mr. Speaker, we remind them yet again that the alternative measures they would have posited do not account for the motion. The motion categorizes resilience in the current context. in the current context of the Caribbean society, tourism is simply not adequately sufficient with the current measures in place. And any measures that can be implemented will be implemented or can only be implemented in the long term. And for that, we say that they have been severely misunderstood in this motion and they would need to do better. And on that, Mr. Speaker, we as the opposition rest.
Madam Speaker, well, all protocols observed. The opposition has laid out many ways to say we are vulnerable. But let me re-emphasize that vulnerability is not the absence of resilience. As a region, we may be mostly small islands, but we have strength in the brand that we have created. We have strength in our support systems, and we have strength in our ability to innovate. The opposition failed to cite sources for many of their arguments. They spoke about the vulnerability of small island developing states and the overdependence on USA has detrimental effects, among others. But where are the sources? Firstly, they spoke about high debt levels in Caribbean economies. They argued that high debt levels limits government's ability to respond to external shocks like USA tariffs. But many countries have worked with the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to reduce debt through physical reforms, example, Jamaica's economic reform program, or even, for example, Barbados in an article, 2023 article entitled Barbados Learns from Experience. They also spoke on the over-reliance on tourism and the lack of sectoral diversification. The opposition argues that tourism dominates Caribbean GDP, so a shock to it is a shock to everything. But many Caribbean countries are already diversifying. For example, the BP in Jamaica, financial services in Cayman, agricultural exports, and creative industries. They said that the Caribbean tourism lacks diversity. Most sources come from the USA. While it is true that the US is the primary source market, the Caribbean has made deliberate efforts to diversify tourist inflows. They spoke that Caribbean economies are over-dependent on imports. The dependence on imports is a broader economic issue, not exclusive to tourism, and many small island economies globally face this. However, the tourism sector itself has adapted with local source growing in agritourism, farm-to-table dining, and craft markets that promote local products. Secondly, they said that Caribbean economies are too weak to withstand the impact of US tariffs. Caribbean economies have proven remarkable resilience during external shocks. COVID-19, for example, global inflation, oil spike prices, and even past recessions. They said that small and medium enterprises are too fragile and will collapse under a US tariff regime. Yes, small and medium enterprises are vulnerable, but they are not without a support, nor are they universally dependent on the US market. The Caribbean region has been proactive in cushioning shocks to small and medium enterprises through targeted funding and capacity building and crisis management programs. They say that Caribbean tourism is too dependent on the US market, so tariffs would severely restrict income and arrivals. Dependence on the US market is being strategically reduced through market diversification efforts targeting Europe and Latin America, according to the Caribbean Tourism Organization and Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management. Members of the opposition, everybody, we understand that this is a time of volatility due to President Trump's tariff regimes. But we are the Caribbean. We are a region that have proven to be incredibly resilient. What have we not survived? We've survived COVID-19, and the little tariff is going to cause us to topple over? No, as a people of the Caribbean, we can push past this. We have done it before, and Madam Speaker, we can do it again. Thank you.
Excellent arguments, and I have to congratulate both coaches, Delon Dale Bennett from Chalamont High and Keisha Dehaney from Knox College. When we return, the Chief Judge will present the winning scores, and that will be Mr. Aldane Reed of the JHTA. Welcome back, and we're at that critical moment when we'll know who the champions are for the 2024 National Tourism Debate. The motion this afternoon, Caribbean tourism is sufficiently resilient to survive the tariff regime imposed by the USA. Both schools, Charlemont High and Knox College, did a fabulous job. We will now invite our Chief Judge, Mr. Aldane Reed from the GHTA, to present the winning scores.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, of course, I have the most unenviable job this afternoon, but of course, I'm very happy to be here and to be a part of this deliberation. I certainly, and I can speak for the judges, this has been an absolutely fantastic afternoon, and I believe our future is in good hands. I think with the deliberations, the debate this afternoon, I mean, we spoke about just how happy we were to see our future generation really speaking on issues which are so vital and so important to our existence in a few years from now and looking forward. So, of course, my job is to speak to what we found today. I believe it is safe to say that both teams did a solid job. I don't think anyone here could make a point that there was any sort of clear distinction between both. I think we had two top-tier teams today. I think that's really why these teams are in the finals. I think it's very clear that the differences between both teams were sort of almost non-existent because, again, quality is something that I think shone through. And I want to make it clear that our decisions and our deliberation was really around the nuances around where the points should go and where points went and whether or not those points spoke to the motion that has been presented today. And so we started sort of looking at that essential point. What was the motion? And in this case, the motion spoke to whether or not the Caribbean could be considered sufficiently resilient in the face of this new tariff. I mean, and again, I start there. This is a new phenomenon. This is something that has just sort of been brought upon us. And so in the context of a debate, generally, the teams will have are going back to historic data. They're going back to substantive data around supporting their point. Difference today is that we're talking about a situation that's unfolding. And so the issues around how one presents their argument presents to us the delicacies around how one can win or lose. Because again, one has to recognize that, I mean, this is an unfolding situation. And so traditionally when you're looking at history, it's easy to look at both sides and say this person reflected history better than the other. And of course, so that's a slippery slope that we sort of saw both teams struggling to figure out how do we stay on point knowing that things could change at this very moment that we're speaking. And so I think in order for us to now really carve out, in this case, a winning team, we had to look at how both persons or how both teams delivered, specifically around what they were trying to do as far as making the case to the audience and to everyone listening, and of course to the judges. I think one of the key things that we saw, and let's just talk about in terms of the teams and just sort of, dissect a little bit around what we saw as being their attempt to make this case, as I said earlier. Now, let's start with the proposing team. I think there was an effort to delineate or to distinguish between vulnerability and resilience. I think that was clear. And I think they made a very strong case around trying to make sure that we understand that resilience, vulnerability is clear, but resilience is what the moot is talking about. And I think we saw where they really made an effort to ensure that the judges understood that, I mean, we see vulnerability, but we also know resilience. And so that was one of the things that we saw coming through very clearly from the first speaker all the way down to the third speaker. And so they were able to break the problems down in that way. I think there was also a lot of data provided around, what other countries and what other persons have been doing in terms of Jamaica and otherwise. And I think they also talked about brand strength. I think, if one is to make a case for vulnerability, there would need to be some position around whether a brand, for example, would be strong enough to to look beyond vulnerability and become and of course maintain resilience. And so I think that was one of the challenges that they have. And I believe they did a fair job in terms of making the case that while we're vulnerable, there is resilience, and we have proven. I mean, they talked about different points around instances where resilience has been proven in the past, and of course, talking about how well it can continue in the future, right? Now, in terms of the opposition, also a very strong case made. And again, speaking on the issue of vulnerability and resilience, I think, as they would have been expected to do, there was a lot of time spent on talking about the vulnerability as far as really, breaking down the over-reliance on U.S. tourism. That's something that one can't argue in terms of, the fragility of our economies, generally talking about the small island development states and so on. Those were very clear, macroeconomic vulnerabilities, things of that nature. I think those things were made very clear, and that was hammered home in a very, very clear way. And so, unequivocally, those vulnerabilities and the shocks and what the impact could be was what I think the crux of the argument was right across the speakers. And I think they made a very good and clear position around what they believe would have been the impact of this tariff regime. As I said earlier, the challenge I think that both teams faced is that we're dealing with a moving target. The issues around tariffs is still very, very fresh, as everyone here knows. And so we looked at the situation around data in terms of supporting the arguments. I think on both sides, there was sort of a failure to grab perhaps more current data. What has happened last week? And again, it is a real challenge because, usually with motions, we are talking about fundamental issues that we're arguing. In this case, this is something that we really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so much of these things have to be delicately dissected to ensure that when that argument is made, there is a clear understanding for the audience and for the judges that this is an evolving story. This is breaking news. And so that is something I believe both teams could have probably tightened up a bit in terms of getting more current data. Yesterday, what happened on NBC last weekend, and how does that tie into what we're talking about here in terms of the Caribbean's ultimate resilience and of course, sufficient resilience in terms of what may happen in the future. That being said, I think, as I said before, let me make it abundantly clear. Both teams were very strong. The winner this afternoon, was not a landslide. The winner today, again, was based on the delicate nuances between the arguments that needed to be made. Again, both teams made solid arguments, but I think we all agreed, it was unanimous, that one team today was stronger than the other in terms of making the points that needed to be made. Now, the scores. Okay, our tally got for the second place winner was 969 points, and our winning team scored 1,014 points. Today, our second place winner would be Knox College at 969. And therefore, our winning team, congratulations to Charlemont at 1,014. And our best speaker today would be Kadia Lee McLean. Congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you.
We'd like to congratulate both our coaches, Mr. Dale Bennett from Charlemont High, Keisha Duhaney, Stacey Ann Lambert from Knox College. Our adjudicators, Mr. Aldane Reed from the JHTA, who acted as our chief judge, Unique Salesman from the Tourism Booster Online, and Kaveh Watt from Jamaica Observer. Our sponsors, Royal Sun Luxury Resorts, the JHTA, Tourism Enhancement Fund, Fontana Pharmacy, Pair One Restaurant. Our production partners, PBCJ, Home Choice Limited, Candice Delight, and Future Leaders. Congratulations to Charlemont and Knox once again. This is the National Tourism Debate.